So the final process that we want to look at are the ways that oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually transported in the blood. Let's start with oxygen. There are two major ways that oxygen is transported within the blood. The first is dissolved in the blood. And it's only about 2% of the oxygen that gets into the blood is found dissolved within the blood itself. It's weird sometimes to think about oxygen being dissolved in blood or a gas being dissolved in a fluid. And so the analogy that I'll make here is with a bottle of pop. When you first get the bottle of pop and you haven't opened it yet, and you look in the side, while you might see a few bubbles, there's actually a lot of gas dissolved within that liquid. When you open the lid, you hear the release of gas and you see the bubbling of gas up out of the fluid where it was once dissolved. Although our blood does not have as much gas within it as this bottle of pop does, there is oxygen dissolved in our blood to some extent. However, the major way that oxygen is transported within our blood is bound to hemoglobin, specifically bound to iron within the heme groups found within the hemoglobin. And we've looked at hemoglobin previously in the unit on blood. Red blood cells are filled with millions of hemoglobin molecules, which are made up of 4 subunits, each of which has a heme group in it with an iron in the middle of the heme group. An oxygen can bind to that iron group, and therefore every molecule of hemoglobin can actually carry up to 4 molecules of oxygen. 98% of oxygen is carried bound to the iron within the heme group in our body. So now let's take a look at carbon dioxide. Dissolved in blood accounts for about 10% of the carbon dioxide. Again, think about the can of pop. It's not a chemical reaction with the blood, but simply dissolved. The second major form is the carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin. But in this case, it's actually not bound to the iron portion within the heme group. I have here a very long term, carb-aminohemoglobin, but this indicates how the carbon dioxide is actually bound to the hemoglobin. The carb is referring to the carbon dioxide. The amino is referring to amino acid in terms of protein. And so carbon dioxide is not bound to the iron in the heme group, but bound to specific amino acids found within the globin portion of the hemoglobin. About 20% of the carbon dioxide is transported in the blood in this way. The final and largest amount of carbon dioxide is transported after being converted to bicarbonate. I'm showing here a molecule of the bicarbonate ion, which is HCO3 with a negative charge of 1-. But let's take a closer look at the reaction here of what goes on when the carbon dioxide gets converted to the bicarbonate ion. What happens is that carbon dioxide will actually leave the tissue, go into the blood, and chemically react with water. Unlike being dissolved in the blood, which is just a physical change, this is actually a chemical reaction where we end up with H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then will break down into hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ion. In this way then, the bicarbonate ion is produced and then is transported around the blood. The reason I have the arrows going forward and backward is because as this is transported around the blood, eventually when the blood gets back to the lungs, the bicarbonate ion will react with the hydrogen ion, reforming carbonic acid, which will then break down into carbon dioxide and water. Ultimately, the carbon dioxide is then exchanged between the blood and the lungs and then breathed out during exhalation. One of the other things that we should point out are the hydrogen ions specifically. Because an increase in hydrogen ions within the solution, within blood in this case, actually changes the pH to a more acidic pH. And so as carbon dioxide is produced within our tissues and released into our blood, as we said, it creates carbonic acid, but it's actually the carbonic acid breaking down into the free hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions that frees up these hydrogen ions and causes a change in pH. This is important because it's related to how we actually regulate breathing. Here we have a picture of the brain, and specifically the brain stem. If we zoom in here, we have the pons and the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata plays a major role in respiratory control. It is connected to inspiratory and expiratory neurons that send signals down to the appropriate muscles to allow us to inhale and exhale. Although the brainstem normally determines the basic rate and depth of breathing, other areas of the brain, including the hypothalamus and cerebral cortex, can also affect breathing patterns. So let's look at some of those now, and then we'll come back to some other ways that the medulla oblongata plays a role in breathing rate. Rapid breathing can occur because of emotional responses like anxiety and fear, a flight or fight response. This, of course, relates back to the nervous system and sympathetic neurons firing, causing a rapid heart rate, and in this case, rapid breathing rate as well. The Herring-Brewer reflex prevents overinflation of the lungs. So as we take one of those inspiratory reserve volume type breaths, as the lungs continue to expand and expand, eventually as the lungs inflate to a maximum capacity, the Herring-Brewer reflex sends signals up to the brain to cause us not to be able to breathe any larger so that we do not overinflate the lungs. Sneezing, coughing, and yawning. Sneezing and coughing, we've already looked in the lymphatic and immune systems in terms of ejecting dust or pathogens from our respiratory system. Yawning is a reflex that a little bit less is known about it, and we're not going to look at in detail in this course. We have peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies. These are receptors within the carotid artery and the aorta. They sense the amount of oxygen within the blood. And as that amount of oxygen decreases under very extreme circumstances, they will send signals to the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata will send signals causing us to breathe faster. We can voluntarily control our breathing as well. I can hold my breath if I want to. This is a voluntary control, but related to the last control here of the central chemoreceptors in the medulla that we mentioned earlier, eventually what will happen is that child will start to breathe. I can hold my breath for as long as I want. However, eventually I will start to breathe. Why is that the case? Well, partially the peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies will send signals to the brain because there's not enough oxygen in the blood. But long before that, the main system that we started talking about in terms of the medulla oblongata is that there are central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata that are monitoring the pH of blood. This goes back to the previous slide, and so we can look at the reaction that we looked at there. Carbon dioxide is being produced by tissues and then going into the blood, reacting with water, forming carbonic acid, which then breaks down into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. As I hold my breath, I'm continuing to produce carbon dioxide. However, I'm not getting rid of it at my lungs. And so more and more carbon dioxide is building up in my blood, reacting with more water, producing more carbonic acid, producing more hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. And because I'm producing more hydrogen ions, my pH is becoming more and more acidic. That change in pH is monitored by those chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, such that as the pH decreases and decreases and I become more acidic in my blood, eventually the medulla is sending such high intensity signals down to my lungs to actually breathe, so that we can drive the reaction in the opposite direction with hydrogen ions combining with the bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid, and then breaking down at the lungs into carbon dioxide and water. I breathe off the carbon dioxide and neutral water is left over in my blood. Beyond the example of holding my breath is even just the nuances of if I were to go for a run right now. The muscles that are being used would produce more carbon dioxide, and therefore my blood would become more acidic because of this reaction. The central chemoreceptors in my medulla oblongata would then monitor that pH, notice it, and then cause me to breathe faster as I ran so that I could get rid of excess carbon dioxide that's being produced during my exercise. As mentioned, this is the major system that is used in order to regulate breathing.